Okay, we had better start here for Q&A. So we have to move the next last speaker. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. The last speaker is Michael Barrie from Sogang University. So the title is Noun, Incorporation, Labeling, and Miracle Create. Yes, please.
Thank you. Just while I load this, there's a slight change in the title. You'll see it here. Oh. Go ahead. I forgot. Sorry, I forgot. Name of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, there's a slight change in the title since I'm not going to talk about the miracle create per se, so much in detail. But it doesn't touch upon some recent concepts. Just ignore this because I didn't post the slides to my website yet, so they're not there. Yeah, you can see there's other slides there. If you just Google my name, Michael Barrie Linguistics, you'll find it. Okay. So one of the questions is, why do we move? Why movement happens? And Miyagawa 2009 suggested that this is for expressive properties of language. The specific mechanism for movement has been something we've talked about for ages, and even so, starting with early minimalism, of course, there's a longer history before that. But things like feature strength or the EPP are sort of diacritics, and we've all known that the EPP is just sort of means like I don't know what's going on, and they're not really explanatory. And alternatives, of course, have been discussed recently. Things like breaking symmetry, so the things dynamic anti-symmetry approach, labeling as a force for movement. Prosody as a force for movement. And I'm going to sort of touch upon some of these today within the context of Noun Incorporation, Pseudo Noun Incorporation. What did these phenomena have to say about the sort of more contemporary takes on why movement takes place? So there's many questions about this. Unfortunately, I have a few answers for you, but I do have a bit to say, and then we can talk about the consequences. One thing is that labels are necessary at PF. How much time do I have? 30 minutes?
40 minutes and 10 minutes before Q&A.
Thank you. Okay. That labels are necessary at PF and LF. Prosody, in addition to semantic properties, can trigger movements, are two of the things I want to talk about, although I won't really talk about prosody very much today. So just by way of background about these different sources of movement. So dynamic anti-symmetry was, as you all know, and people have talked about today, proposed in 2000 as a means to achieve an anti-symmetric structure. And the strong version of Morrow's proposal was that all movement can be boiled down to achieving anti-symmetry, that is to alleviating the tree from points of symmetry. So If you have any sort of point of symmetry, it triggers movement. And the famous example of this is Italian. So the English word order and the Italian word order is almost the same, so you can just see easily. So this picture was the cause of the riot, and the cause of the riot was this picture. So this is the same as English up to this point. And this has to be, in English you have to say it one of these two ways, because English, as you know, has the EPP, which we don't know what it is, which means we have to have some subject. But as we all know, Italian is not like that. Nevertheless, this is completely ungrammatical of Italian. So Italian, which otherwise doesn't require an overt subject in spec TP, seems to require it in this position. So there was no way to just leave these two DPs in situ. One of them has to raise. And Moore's argument, of course, that the two DPs form the point of symmetry and one of them gets kicked out. The basic structure looks something like this. He discussed other points of symmetry, but this is the one of importance right now. So you have two nominals, or two phrases. They don't have to be nominals in the configuration that you see. And the problem is that DPA asymmetrically C commends beta, and DPB asymmetrically C commends alpha, and you're going to get a contradictory ordinary. And to alleviate that, one of them has to move. And then that explains the Italian facts. It appears that in there. So moving on with symmetry, Ott proposes split topics in German, and they arise by movement. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but this is, in English, you have something, like as for books, Peter, unfortunately, has only read 3 good ones. And the idea here is that in 3 is the underlying word order for German, and then you have the NP books and the DP3 good. There's no ones in German. And it's similar to the Italian facts here. You have 2 nominals that form a point of symmetry, but what Dennis Ott said was that these 2 things can't be labeled, so one of them has to be kicked out. And this leads us from the dynamic anti-symmetry approach to the labeling approach that we're more familiar with. In basic bare phrase structure, when you merge 2 things, so I think I'm missing something there. This is a bit better, yeah. So you merge 2 things, something has to be the label, and the label should either be Y or Z. We have a more complicated algorithm now. If you merge 2 heads together, one of them better be the root, and we've heard alternatives to this here today. If you merge a head and a phrase together, then the head is the label. Again, with Nina Jones' presentation today, that's not entirely the case. And if we merge 2 phrases, that's when things get tricky. If they share a common criterial feature, that's the label. Otherwise, again, if they don't share a feature, you get a point of symmetry. Well, in the earlier terms, you don't get a label, and one of the 2 things gets kicked out, and the other one has to form the label. And there's a lot of ongoing research and different ideas about this now, which some of it I'm going to touch on later when I get to what I want to talk about. That's what I just said a minute ago. Yes. Well, one thing I wanted to talk about is why labels are. So clearly, this proposal suggests that labels are somehow important. And the idea is that labels are needed for interpretation at the CI interface was one proposal. This is something Chomsky just sort of suggests, but didn't really give any empirical support for. Collins tried to eliminate labels altogether, saying that they're not important. Potential roles for labels would be selection and PF. So selection, usually strictly local, Mary ate an apple. The verb selects the apple, so selection is usually strictly local. And Collins gives the following problem. Mary said that Pat left. Mary demanded that Pat leave. And what looks like is going on is that the matrix verb is selecting the form of the embedded verb here, so either indicative or subjunctive. Okay, so Collins suggests the following pretty reasonable structure, a CP dominating a mood phrase, dominating a TP, and that the verb selects a particular value of mood, in effect bypassing the CP. So that means, so if selection can take place at a distance, then you don't really need labels here. This is Collins' argument, not mine. So there is a counter argument for this based on data from Bruning et al. That the verb selects an indicative C head, which in turn selects an indicative mood head. This is one way to think about it. And there's evidence for this from Romanian. Now the distinction is neutralized in English, but it's overt in Romanian. So I consider Yon to be a smart boy, and the important thing here is the form of the declarative complementizer here. I want him to succeed. This is a subjunctive, and the form of the complementizer is here. Don't get confused. It's a sheer coincidence that the English verb consider and the Romanian verb consider are the same. Don't be confused. Okay, but there are other selectional properties as well. So, for example, in control, a verb selects a CP, and a raising verb, a control verb selects a CP, and a raising verb selects a TP. And if Collins is right, that a verb must merely select a complement that contains T, then we would expect to be able to generate structures like this, which assumedly do not converge. So we want the head to be able to select the category of its complement, even if it does have other featural constraints. And he very briefly mentions PF, but dismisses it. But as for PF, many languages have prosodic differences, say, between DP. It's very common for DP and VP to have different prosodic differences. There are differences between nouns and verbs prosodically in many, many languages. So I'm going to give more arguments in a second. But it seems that we need labels both at LF and at PF. This is why, under the theory where labeling is responsible for movement, that's why it takes place overtly rather than covertly, because we need them both at LF and at PF. Okay, so does labeling completely replace symmetry? So there's a string link between symmetry breaking and labeling here, which I'm not going to totally talk about. But the Italian data doesn't seem to be able to be explained by a strong T alone. The idea in Italian, of course, under labeling theory is that strong T can label the T, and you don't need to move anything to spec TP, unlike English where T is weak and you do need to move something. It seems that symmetry might still play a role here. And later on, not yet, later on I'm going to reconsider labels in light of Vilchko's theory of grammatical number when we look at pseudo-noun incorporation and okay. So first, prosody of it, contiguity. Okay, so contiguity theory by Norman Richards, and the notion by Clemens that the head and a complement must be phrased together. So in both of these proposals, you have movement to satisfy constraints of the prosodic structure. For Norman Richards, he explains WH movement versus WH in situ. This takes place to satisfy prosodic constraints of the languages. Also, the EPP and V to T movement, these all take place to satisfy prosodic constraints of the languages. And, this would be several hours of discussion to go through it all. I'm not going to go through it all. I'm just going to talk about those parts of prosodic movement that relate to pseudo incorporation. So for Clemens, she proposes that there is a viable constraint that the head and its complement be phrased together in the same phonological phrase. Now, if the complement is a DP is a phase, it gets spelled out separately. And so once the DP is spelled out, it's gone, and you just have the verb by itself. So the head here doesn't have a complement since the complement is, off at PF and LF. And so there's no constraint, there's no reason for it to be phrased together. She assumes that little n is not a phase, that within the novel domain only D is a phase head. So that if you have a verb and a little np, then they're in the same phase. There's no reason, the little np doesn't get spelled out. So this P and I object over here has to be adjacent. This thing has to be phrased together. This thing doesn't have to be phrased together because this thing is, I was so good at this during COVID, now I've forgotten how to do it all. The DP object has been spelled out and is not there anymore. Now how do I get rid of that? Okay, good. Now you go away. Okay, yeah. Yes, during COVID I could do that much faster. Okay, so now for the discussion for what I want to talk about. So labeling is clearly deriving movement under some of the current assumptions that I've made here. It's needed for selection. It's also needed at PF for match theory. So match theory is one of the most widespread theories of the syntax-prosody interface these days. And match theory requires us to understand what the maximal projections are. Maximal projections correspond to phonological phrases, and prosody is built off syntactic structure. We know that. And so in some languages, if you with a a specifier gives rise to ternary branching in the prosody. So we have to understand the difference between a maximal projection that has an overt specifier and one that does not. And the only way we can do that is if we see what the labels are within the clause. So match theory crucially requires labels to be present. So yes, you have to distinguish between maximal projections and intermediate projections. Okay. So the part that is going to be important for us here requires us to look at Martina Vilchko's theory about projecting versus adjoining number. And in short, they're here on the screen right now. So the one on the left is the one we're more familiar with, going back to Ritter. So number is, in this model, number is obligatory. In the model on the right, the num head doesn't project like in English, it merely adjoins to little np. And here it's optional. And in a language like English where number projects, the DP is either singular or plural, so you can't. So if you say the dog, that has to have a singular interpretation. As opposed to Kalkamelum, well that was the language Martina Vilchko did, where if the num head is present, of course you get a plural reading, but if this num head is absent, then you just get a number neutral reading. You just get a general number reading. And there are other differences between these, but these two are good enough for now. Okay, and crucially, this results in a difference in the label. So here we have, this is labeled as a nump, and this is labeled as a little np. So that difference in the label is crucial for, in this case, LF. Okay. Now, what are the predictions with pseudo incorporation, labeling, and the Vilchko's theory of number? Okay, so we have to look at how labels play a role in pseudonym incorporation. So labels are formed in the overt syntax. They're necessary for PF and LF, as they've said, and they must be formed overtly. Hence, because they're necessary to PF and LF. So we have evidence for this from pseudonym incorporation. So the verb can select a full DP object. That's the sort of the standard case. Okay, and we have a brief overview of P&I here. I'm just going to very briefly look at this. That's fine. Okay, so P&I, pseudonym incorporation, results from the verb selecting a reduced nominal, either a little np or a nump, usually something along those lines. And it's also the failure of the object to move away from its position of the complement of the verb. So a full DP can scramble or undergo focus fronting and end up way far away from the verb. But a pseudo-incorporated object is normally adjacent to it, hence that's how it's got its name. And the size can vary, and we're going to look at this here. So just a brief picture of this. So here's a verb, the subject with ergative marking, the object with absolutive marking, so a nice transitive sentence. And here we have the verb. Notice now that the object is adjacent to it and it has not marked for case. And as a consequence, the subject now is marked with absolutive case, so it's acting as though it were intransitive. This is a very prototypical example of pseudo-noun incorporation. Okay, so there are two options. There are various options here. So the verb selects a number phrase, and number projects and is valued as either singular or plural. That's one option. Or the verb selects a little np, and if number projects, it would not be available in a pseudo-noun incorporation construction. And finally, if the verb selects a little np, if number adjoins, it may optionally appear in a pseudo-noun incorporation construction. So we make predictions here as to what kinds of constructions we can see for P&I. So let's look at Hindi first. Hindi has obligatory number marking. Because I'm running out of time, I think, I'm just going to briefly show you. If you look at 10AB, that just shows you that, you know, the noun will be either singular or plural, but it has to be either singular or plural. You get obligatory number markings, very similar to English, and you get agreement with number. If Ram or Sita caught a fish, you get singular agreement with the fish on the verb. And pseudo-noun incorporation has number marking as well. So in Hindi P&I, the verb selects a noun. So here, there's an example, look after children, and it selects it doesn't show that very easily there, sorry about that, but it shows the plural. The object is plural, right here. And this is a pseudo-incorporated construction. In Nuayan, number marking is obligatory, so you see the people, you get plural marking there. The person, no plural marking, so it's somewhat similar to English in terms of how plural marking works. It's a little more complicated in Nuayan than English, but it's kind of similar. And that's just more just examples. I'm not going to go through them to show you that you get plural marking is pervasive throughout the clause in Nuayan. Okay, so this suggests that you have the noun head that projects, and the P&I cannot have plural marking, suggesting that Nuayan pseudo incorporates just a little NP. So you can, here's an example of, an attempted example of pseudo incorporation of a plural object. Notice again the subject is absolutive case, and there's no case marking on the object here. So this is pseudo incorporation, but you cannot have a plural marking here. You can only have singular marking, as we saw before. And then the final example is Nepali. You get optional number marking here, and 5 minutes, okay. So here's the example with optional number marking. It's somewhat similar to Korean, and you get optional number marking on demonstratives and verbs as well. And again, it's optional. So it has all the stereotypical cases of adjoining number. So caseless objects in Nepali are very similar to pseudo-noun incorporation. They take a low scope, they tend to be close to the verb. And since it's a non-projecting number, P&I takes an little np complement, but since number adjoins to little np, it predicts that number could appear in pseudo-incorporation constructions, which it can. So example B, example A, is 8 bananas, and example B is wants to buy some cars, has no specific cars in mind, but we can still mark the car with plural. So looking at the structure, this is a little bit easier. So here, if you have a projecting number, then P&I can target nump, or can target little np, And if it targets little np, if it only targets this, then you can never have number, which is what we saw for Nuwayan. And if it targets nump, then you have obligatory number marking, which is what we saw for Hindi. And if you have a joining number like this, where P&I targets little np, then number marking is optional as well, like it is in a main clause. And so those are the three things that we saw. And I'll try to sort of finish up here. So this was just a few notes about noun incorporation. So there is an interesting asymmetry here that noun incorporation, which is usually much smaller than pseudo incorporation, typically obligatorily involves movement, whereas pseudo noun incorporation in the bottom tree, usually that's the hallmark there is that there's no movement, and that's why the verb and the object are adjacent. Under the old story, Baker 88, head movement feeds word formation, and under bare phrase structure, the incorporated noun is just a head, not a noun phrase. So it looks like this, and then you have a point of symmetry. It's resolved by movement, and it just sort of moves up. And hence, movement is required. We've shown, it's been shown recently, well, by me and others, it's been shown that noun incorporation is actually incompatible with head movement and involves incorporation of a small xp. The exact derivation is still unclear. I just put this here for fun because under our current understanding of noun incorporation and bare phrase structure, it's really unclear exactly how noun incorporation works. It seems to reduce to prosody. So in this case, the material in the little np lacks word level prosody, so a PF is forced to undergo some kind of merger, as opposed to pseudonoun incorporation, where the little np has the status of a phonological word, and so it's quite happy sitting on its own, and it doesn't have to move anywhere. It's not a DP, so it's not going to be like topicalized or undergo focus fronting or anything like that, so it just stays put. Okay, we're going to skip that part because it doesn't really apply. It's a little thing about object shift. And I'm running out of time. So there's a prosodic requirement for the verb and the object to remain together. And I talked about that briefly. Under Norman Richards's approach, contiguity, once satisfied, can be broken. So for Clemens, the DP is invisible for this constraint, so it can move wherever. So usually only full DPs can be topics or undergo focus fronting. But there's no reason for the P&I object to move because it's not eligible for any of these sort of criterial type relations. So it tends to stay put. So by way of conclusion, so P&I, maybe I'm finishing early, maybe I'm too fast, sorry. P&I shows clear evidence that the language makes use of local selection, and that hence labels, I think I put that there, labels are necessary, and we get a bit of a predicted typology of a pseudonoun incorporation here, that chart's not the easiest one to read. So for example, ignore the part on the left, the part on the right is what's more interesting. So the target of pseudonoun incorporation could either be nump or little np, and if it's nump, then obviously it's because number projects, and you get obligatory number marking in Hindi. If the target of P&I is little np, and if number adjoins, then number can optionally appear inside the pseudo-incorporated structures like we saw in the poly. But if number projects its own head, then it's impossible for it to appear in a pseudo-incorporated construction. And that's what we saw for Nuwayan. And I think that's it. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. So is there any, are there any comments? Please.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk very much. Yeah, just out of curiosity, like you just talk about pseudo incorporation in verb and complement relation. Is there a possibility of pseudo incorporation from subject?
Oh, well, I think they found, normally no.
Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think, why can't the subject be pseudo-incorporated? I was about to say, normally no, but they found evidence in Mongolian for subject incorporation. So it might be then that subject incorporation is just rarer for some reason. I strongly suspect it has to do with the fact that the subject, there's an overwhelming cross-linguistic tendency for subjects to be topics, and a topic has to be a DP. So you have to find a situation where where the grammatical subject is not a topic. And maybe, like some languages don't really like that. I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for that, other than subjects tend to be topics and therefore tend to be DPs. But I would probably want to look more at the Mongolian facts because they found subject pseudo-incorporation in Mongolian.
And just one more follow-up question is about, not exactly follow-up, but you also talk about the regular pseudo incorporation in light of prosody. Then usually which one is like a low flat prosody. So in the case like a WH has a theory of like a WH, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So then between noun and verb, one must be like dependent, prosodically dependent. So that would you characterize pseudo incorporation in terms of prosody dependency?
Yeah, definitely. So I've looked at the prosody of pseudo-noun incorporation in a few different languages, and what we've tended to find is that the verb and the pseudo-incorporated object are phrased together into one prosodic domain, and that the full DP object exhibits more prosodic independence. It depends on the language, but the full object is an independent prosodic word with internal structure, whereas the pseudo-incorporated object either lacks the property of being a prosodic word, or it's a minimal prosodic word. So within match theory, you can have recursive phrases and recursive phonological phrases and recursive phonological words. So the full DP object is a recursive phonological word, and the pseudo-incorporated object is a minimal prosodic word, which has different prosodic correlates to it. So yeah, definitely what you're saying, it holds as well.
Because Korean, like noun and like verb, usually it's do you think the Korean, Sino-Korean noun and like verb, that involves pseudo noun incorporation or what? But when I saw Hindi examples, I saw the regular noun and regular verbs. They are involved in pseudo noun incorporation. That's why Hindi is quite different from Korean. Alleged Korean pseudo noun incorporation.
Yeah. So my instinct is to say that the lexical portion and the like verb do probably form a prosodic category. Korean is interesting because the like verbs, the lexical portion of the like verb can actually take accusative case. So study, do, study, accusative, do, 공부하다, 공부하다. And I'm really not clear on the semantic differences between those. What I have done is with a colleague of mine, we've looked at something that looks like pseudo incorporation inside a nominalization structure, where the object obligatorily lacks accusative case, and we found a very strong correlation between the accusative marked object and the non and the caseless object, the obligatorily caseless object.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I have a comment related about the question of why subject pseudo incorporation is rare, much rarer than object incorporation. So if I actually relate it to the label thing, because so label is determined by search in my search prompt and the highest node in the structure. And when the search hits V, you have a little NP or non-P as it's say complement, right? So again at the same height in the object position. While in the case of subjects, when you hit let's say V, it's already the end the phrase, so say small NP or non-P much higher than that, like at least XP by the structure, right? Like so in other words, when you hit the little NP or non-P, which is the target of the incorporation, you still haven't found the verb which attracts the phrase, right?
Right.
Which will form a prosodic unit or whatever, right? So the difference in height in the structure for the search, which is of course used for labeling, might be relevant for the subject of asymmetry of the Sogang incorporation.
So, as the object is being formed, it doesn't know yet it's going to eventually be selected by something, and so I don't think I understood the difference in the height.
In the case of object, so say in the sequence case, right? So small NP is the complement of V.
Right.
Yeah. In this case, when you search, the search hits little search hits V and little NP, the phrase, entire phrase,
Right.
which is the target of the pseudo incorporation. Right. So and the target means that it's say attracted by V or in a broader sense. Right. But in the case of subject, there is at least XVY structure,
Right.
even if we don't assume little VP, right? So you have, say, from isonode on one, you have a little NP and say VP, and at the next time, at the next level, that you have say little M and V. But the incorporation, the target of the pseudo incorporation for V is little NP and not M. So the same height of search, you have different elements. We can think about the way of implementing this intuition, but my intuition is that when search is the verb V, no V, you either have NP in the phrase or just the head at the same height.
Right. Yeah. Then it might derive a difference.
Yeah, it might. Yeah. But that could actually take advantage of your argument for the necessity of labeling for pseudo incorporation. So this is just a small possibility.
Thank you. Yeah.
So the last question or comments? No? Yes. Again, thank you for your good presentations. So we.